The moment I stepped through my son's front door, I could feel something was wrong. Not the kind of wrong you can point to, the kind that sits in your chest before your mind catches up to it. My name is Nadine Smith, and I raised a boy who used to tell me everything. I hadn't seen Doyle in person since before his wedding. No, before I even knew there was a wedding. A year of phone calls that never lasted more than 5 minutes. Always busy. Always about to walk into something. Never once did he turn that camera on. I told myself that's just how young men are when they're building a life. I believed it because I wanted to. His 30th birthday felt like the right time to stop waiting on a call and just go see him myself. If you're watching this with me right now, tell me what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's sitting with me while I tell this. The house was bigger than I expected. Nicer car in the driveway than I expected too. Doyle opened the door looking well, healthy, put together, a man who'd clearly been taking care of himself. He hugged me the way he used to when he was a boy, tight and quick, like he was embarrassed to need it. "Look at you," I said, holding his face in my hands. 30 years old. Aren't you tired of being a bachelor, running around by yourself all this time? I meant it as a joke, a mother's tease. I wasn't ready for what came next. Before Doyle could answer, a door opened down the hallway and a young woman stepped out. Pregnant. Very pregnant. The kind of pregnant where walking looks like work. She smiled at me, warm and easy, like we already knew each other. "Mrs. Smith," she said, "I'm so glad you're finally here. We got married a year ago. We're due next month." I heard the words. I understood every one of them, but my body took a moment to catch up to what my ears had just handed me. A year, a wife, a grandchild coming in weeks, and not one phone call, not one photograph, not one hint in 12 months of conversation. I looked at my son, waiting for him to tell me this woman was confused, that there'd been some mistake. Instead, Doyle rubbed the back of his neck, glanced at her, then back at me, and said the words I will carry for the rest of my life. The wedding was for important people only, Ma. I have been cussed out. I have been disrespected. I have buried a husband and stood in rooms full of people who didn't want me there. Nothing prepared me for hearing that sentence come out of my own child's mouth. In his own home, with his wife standing right there smiling like she hadn't just watched him say it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him what he meant by it, because I understood exactly what he meant by it. I looked at the young woman, Junella, she told me her name was, and I smiled at her the way you smile at someone who doesn't yet understand what she's just witnessed. "Well," I said, "I'm glad you're both healthy. That baby is going to be beautiful." I hugged my son goodbye. I hugged my daughter-in-law goodbye, gently, mindful of her belly. I told them to call me if they needed anything before the baby came. Then I walked out to my car, got in, closed the door, and drove off without a single tear falling. Doyle stood in that doorway watching me leave, and I could see it in the mirror. The way his face changed once my calm didn't crack. He expected me to be hurt. He expected me to cry or yell or turn around and demand answers. I gave him none of that, because a woman who raised herself up from nothing doesn't waste her breath on a son who's already decided she isn't important. She goes home. She thinks, and she plans. I didn't cry on the drive home. I didn't cry that night either. Grief has a way of waiting until you're alone enough to trust it, and I wasn't ready to give it that trust yet. Instead, I did what I always do when my chest gets tight. I went looking for Herschel, not the man. He's been gone 8 years now. I went looking for his handwriting, his decisions, the parts of him he left behind in paper, because he was never much of a talker when it mattered most. I keep his old office exactly as he left it. Same desk, same chair that still creaks on the left side, same filing cabinet he never let anybody else touch. Herschel built Smith Freight from one truck and a prayer. I watched him grow it into something that fed our family and half the families of men who drove for him. And I watched our son grow up inside that company too, sweeping floors at 15, learning engines and routes and invoices before he'd even picked a class ring. Doyle earned his knowledge of that business. I have never once denied that. But when Herschel got sick and we both knew the end was closer than either of us wanted to say out loud, he sat me down and told me something I didn't fully understand until tonight, standing in his office with my coat still on. "Don't give him the wheel yet," he told me. "Not because he can't drive. Because he ain't learned what happens when the road gets hard, and don't nobody clap for you." I asked him then if he was sure. Doyle was 22, hungry, proud of every callus on his hands. Herschel just shook his head slow, like a man who'd already seen a future the rest of us hadn't caught up to. I left the company to me. Not because I wanted the weight of it, because my husband asked me to carry it until our son was ready to carry it right. Doyle never said it outright, but I've felt the resentment in him for 8 years. In the way he calls it, the company, instead of our company. In the way he waits for me to finish a sentence before he agrees with it, even when he doesn't. A son can love his mother and still feel like she's standing between him and the man he thinks he's supposed to be. Tonight, standing in that office, I understood something I hadn't let myself sit with before. Doyle didn't marry in secret because he was ashamed of me. He married in secret because he needed, just once, to make a decision nobody could take credit for but him. That doesn't excuse what he said in that hallway today, but it explains it. I opened Herschel's bottom desk drawer, the one that sticks if you don't lift while you pull. Inside, underneath old tax records and a photograph of Doyle at 16 grinning next to his first truck, I found the original shareholder agreement Herschel had drawn up years before he ever gave Doyle a single share. I hadn't read it closely in years. I sat down at that creaking desk, and I read every line of it slow, the way you read something when you already suspect it's about to matter again. By the time I finished, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was already 3 moves ahead. There's a particular kind of pride that comes right before a fall, and I've learned it rarely announces itself. It just quietens a man down right before it opens his mouth too wide. 3 years ago, I gave my son 10% of everything his father built. I remember the day clear as anything. Doyle was 27, still living close by then, still coming around for Sunday dinners without me having to ask twice. I called him into Herschel's old office, the same one I sat in the night I found that agreement, and I told him it was time. "You've earned this," I told him, sliding the papers across the desk. Every bit of it. 15 years old, sweeping floors, and now, look at you. I watched his face when he read the number. 10% isn't nothing. It was real ownership, real stake, a piece of his father's name that belonged to him and couldn't be taken back. What I didn't expect was how fast pride turned into something else in his eyes. "So, it's mine," he said. Not a question. A confirmation he was already building on. "It's yours," I told him. "But there's a condition in there, same one your father put in from the start. You can't sell it, transfer it, or borrow against it without the board signing off. That's not me holding you back, baby. That's protecting what your father built until when?" His voice had an edge I hadn't heard from him before. "Until it needs protecting less," I said. He didn't argue. He understood the condition plainly enough. I watched it register on his face, watched him nod along with every word. He wasn't confused about what the papers said. He hugged me, thanked me, told me he wouldn't let his father down. I believed every word of it. What I didn't understand yet was that Doyle had heard the restriction and simply decided it didn't apply to the part of himself that mattered most to him. He knew he couldn't sell the shares or borrow against them without approval. What he took from that room wasn't a misreading of the paperwork. It was a decision that ownership itself, even a caged kind, meant he'd arrived somewhere I no longer had a say in. The shares were real. In his mind, so was the freedom he'd assigned to them, restriction or not. What I didn't know that day, what I'd only pieced together much later from things people mentioned in passing, small comments that meant nothing until they meant everything, was what Doyle told his friend Elsie Prather that same night. They'd known each other since high school. Elsie always a step behind Doyle in ambition, but never in opinion. According to what I'd hear later, Doyle showed up at Elsie's place still holding a copy of those papers, practically glowing. 10%, Doyle told him. Real shares. My name on paper next to my daddy's company. Elsie asked him what that meant for him now. I imagine it casual, the kind of question a friend asks to keep another man talking. It means, I don't need nobody's permission for anything anymore, Doyle said. Not the board, not nobody. I wasn't in that room. But knowing my son the way I do, I can see how that moment must have looked. Doyle certain he just stepped into a kind of freedom the paperwork never actually gave him, and a friend across the table just quiet enough, just agreeable enough, to let him keep believing it. Doyle thought he'd been handed a key. He'd been handed a cage with a very good lock, and he hadn't read the fine print on his own certainty. I wasn't there the day my son got married. I want to say that plain, because it still sits strange in my mouth even now, telling it. Everything I know about that day, I learned in pieces, long after it mattered. A comment from Junella here, a slip from Doyle there, enough fragments that I could eventually see the whole picture, even standing outside of it. It happened during one of Doyle's work leaves, the kind he used to take a few times a year to clear his head. He told me once it was a fishing trip. I believed him, same as I believed everything else that year. It wasn't a fishing trip. It was a small courthouse ceremony in a town I'd never even heard him mention, with a handful of guests who fit comfortably in 2 rows of folding chairs. Junella's parents, Grady and Corliss, a cousin or two on her side, no one from ours, because there was no one from ours to invite. Junella wore a simple ivory dress she told me later she'd found on a rack 2 weeks before, never dreaming she'd be wearing it that soon. She said it felt like the happiest day of her life, and I believe that. I've never once doubted that girl's heart in any of this. Grady asked Doyle before the ceremony started, plain and respectful, the way I'm told he does everything, whether his mother would be joining them. She couldn't make it, Doyle told him. Something came up. She sends her love. I never sent anything. I didn't know there was anything to send love to. But Grady had no reason to doubt him. Why would he? A mother missing her son's wedding over some conflict is a disappointing thing, not a suspicious one. Corliss even told Junella she hoped I wasn't too heartbroken about missing it, and that they'd make sure to have me over properly soon to make up for it. They believed my son, simply and completely, the way decent people believe other people until they're given a reason not to. Doyle stood up there and said his vows to a woman who loved him plainly, in front of a family who'd welcomed him without a single condition attached. And he did it all without once mentioning that the woman missing from those folding chairs didn't know the wedding existed at all. I think about what must have gone through him in that moment. Whether some part of him felt the weight of the lie sitting right there next to his new wedding ring. whether he told himself it wasn't really a lie, just a delay. A story he'd correct later when the time felt right. The time never did feel right. Not for a year. Junella told me once, much later, that on the drive back from the courthouse that day, glowing, still holding her small bouquet, she'd asked Doyle when they'd get to sit down properly with his mother. A dinner, maybe. Something to make it feel real to the rest of the family. Doyle told her soon. He turned the radio up a little louder. He asked if she was hungry and started talking about where they should stop to eat. She let it go that day. She had no reason yet not to. I did not know, driving home from my own quiet life that same afternoon, that somewhere I'd never been, my son had just started a marriage, standing on a lie he'd decided I wasn't important enough to correct. Junella told me all of this much later, in a quieter season of our lives, when the truth had already settled between us and there was no more use in softening it. She told it to me slow, like she was still trying to understand it herself. After the wedding, Doyle wanted a house. Not any house. One nicer than what they could easily afford on his salary alone. A place with a yard big enough for the child they were already hoping for. Junella asked him more than once if it made sense to wait, to save a little longer. Maybe look at something smaller first. Doyle wouldn't hear it. "I've been working since I was 15, he told her. "I'm not asking my mother for a dime. This is mine to handle." I didn't know it then, but that house payment sat on him heavier than he let anyone see. Junella said he started coming home tighter around the shoulders, quicker to sigh at small things, a bill on the counter, a slow line at the store, a question asked at the wrong moment. Nothing dramatic. Just a man carrying something he refused to put down or share the weight of. She said she didn't mind the budgeting, the eating in more, the trips they didn't take. What she minded was watching him disappear a little further into himself every week, like some door in him was quietly closing. One evening, a few months before that birthday visit, Junella brought up something she'd been sitting on for a while. "I want you to call your mother," she said. "Not for money, Doyle. I'm not saying that. I just think she should know about the baby before it's too late to feel like good news." Doyle didn't answer right away. Junella said he kept his eyes on the mail he was sorting, jaw working like he was chewing on something bitter. "She should hear it from us," Junella went on, gentle, careful. "Not find out after. I don't want our child's grandmother finding out secondhand." "I said I'd handle it," Doyle told her, still not looking up. "When?" "When I said I would." Junella said she let it sit a moment, then tried once more, softer. "I just don't understand why it has to be some big secret. She's your mother. Whatever's between you two." "You don't know what's between us," Doyle snapped, sharp enough that Junella said she actually flinched. "You don't know her. You don't know what it's like being somebody's charity case your whole life. So don't sit here acting like calling her is simple." The room went quiet after that. Junella said she didn't argue back. She just looked at him a long moment, hurt plain on her face, and went on folding the laundry she'd been folding before any of it started. Doyle told her later that night he was sorry for snapping. But Junella said it wasn't a real apology, not the kind that explains itself. Just a quiet, "my bad," muttered while he was already halfway into something else, already moving on like the moment hadn't cracked something between them. She let it go. She always let it go. But she told me all this time later that it was the first night she remembered thinking, clear as anything. My husband is carrying something heavier than a house payment, and he'd rather break under it alone than let his own mother help lift it. A week passed after that visit before I let myself walk into the company offices again. I needed that week. Not to cry, though I did some of that too, alone, late, where no one could see it and turn it into something to worry over. I needed the week to decide what kind of woman I was going to be about all this. The kind who calls her son and demands an explanation, or the kind who watches, quiet and patient, until she understands exactly what she's dealing with. I chose quiet. I've always believed loud is for people who don't have another option. Monday morning, I sat down at my desk and asked for the last 2 years of departmental reports. Not because I suspected anything specific, just because a woman needs somewhere to put her hands when her heart is busy healing. What I found stopped me halfway through my coffee. Doyle had been quietly expanding his own authority for the better part of a year, signing off on vendor contracts that used to require 2 signatures, approving equipment purchases without routing them through the finance committee the way policy required. Small things individually. Nothing anyone would call theft or fraud. Just a man slowly widening the door of his own authority, an inch at a time, betting no one was paying close enough attention to notice. I notice now. I thought about calling him right then, asking him plainly why. He'd been operating like a man already running things when the paperwork said otherwise. But something stopped my hand from reaching for the phone. If I confronted him today, he'd have an explanation ready by tonight. Doyle's always been quick that way. Quick to reason his way into looking innocent, even when he isn't lying. Exactly. He'd tell me it was efficiency. He'd tell me the finance committee was slow, that he was just keeping things moving the way his father would have wanted. Maybe some of that would even be true. But I didn't get where I am in this business by reacting to the first version of a story. I got here by waiting for the second version, and the third, until I could see the whole shape of a thing before I said a word about it. I called Verlene Threadgill that afternoon, careful with my questions, casual in a way I hope didn't sound as careful as it felt. She confirmed what the reports already told me. Doyle had been operating with more freedom than his role technically allowed, and most of the board had simply assumed I knew, since he was my son. I let her believe I did know. I wasn't ready yet to let anyone see how far my own house had drifted from my sight. That evening, sitting in Herschel's office again, that same drawer still cracked open from the week before, I finally understood what I was actually deciding. This was never going to be about punishing my son for a wedding I wasn't invited to. That wound was mine to carry quietly. This was about a company Herschel built with his hands, being quietly reshaped by a man who wasn't ready to hold it the way his father always said he wasn't. I picked up the phone and dialed Roscoe Weathersby's office. "Roscoe," I said when he picked up, "I need you to walk me through something. If I wanted to restructure some operational authority, nothing to do with shares, nothing Doyle legally owns, how much room do I actually have to work with?" There was a pause on his end. The kind of pause a good lawyer gives you right before he tells you something you need to hear slowly. "Depends," he said, "on how much you're willing to do quietly, Nadine, and how much you're ready for him to notice." Roscoe called me back 2 days later with a plan simple enough to fit on one page, which is usually how you know a plan is a good one. Every company that's had the same signing structure for 8 years is due for what's called a post-transition performance review, he told me. It's routine. Boards do it all the time after a founder's passing, especially once enough time has gone by that nobody remembers to question it. You're not targeting Doyle. You're reviewing every signing authority across the company, his included. And if he asks why now, then the honest answer is it's overdue, which it is. I brought it to the board that Thursday. 9 of us around that same long table Herschel used to sit at, Doyle included, 2 seats down from me like always. I kept my voice even, businesslike, the same tone I'd use discussing insurance premiums or fuel costs. "With the company 8 years past transition," I said, "I think it's time we formally review operational signing authority across departments. Standard practice, long overdue, if we're honest." A few heads nodded. Verlene included, though I caught the careful way she avoided looking directly at Doyle when she did it. Doyle didn't object. Not there. Not in front of everyone. He simply asked evenly what the review would look like. Individual meetings, I told him. Nothing dramatic. Just bringing paperwork in line with practice, and practice in line with policy. He nodded, wrote something down, and the meeting moved on to fuel contracts like nothing had happened at all. His individual review came 3 days later. I wasn't in the room for it. I'd asked Roscoe and our operations director to handle it directly. Cleaner that way. Less like a mother reaching into her son's business, and more like exactly what it was. A company doing what companies do. I heard about it after. The way I hear about most things now, secondhand and careful. Doyle's independent signing authority on vendor contracts was suspended pending review. His equipment purchase approvals now required a second signature, same as everyone else's, same as they always should have. Nothing was taken from him that wasn't already, technically, supposed to require oversight in the first place. On paper, it was clean. It was fair. It applied, at least in theory, to every department head in the building. Doyle knew better than to make noise about something so airtight. But I understood my son well enough to know silence from him never meant peace. It meant he was looking for the seam in something, the place where it might come apart if he pressed the right way. I found out what he did next, only because Verlene told me herself, a little uneasy, the following week. Doyle had caught her alone near the loading dock office, she said, direct in a way that wasn't like him in front of people who weren't family. Something's happening, he told her. This review, the timing of it, right after my mother's visit to my house. That's not a coincidence, Verlene, and I think you know that. Verlene said she kept her face as neutral as she could manage. I think, she told him, careful with every word, that this company is finally doing what it should have done years ago. I wouldn't read more into it than that, Doyle. He studied her a long moment, she said. Long enough that she wasn't sure whether he believed her or was simply deciding what to do about not believing her. Then he thanked her and walked away without another word. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this part like I was standing in the room watching it unfold. I wasn't. I only understood the full shape of it much later, once paperwork and dates started lining up in ways that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. But I know it now, and I think it matters that you know it too, before my son ever did. While Doyle was still turning Verlene's careful non-answer over in his mind, Elsie Prather was sitting in his own kitchen, over a month before that conversation ever happened, filing paperwork to register a logistics company of his own. Over a month before. I want you to sit with that timing the way I had to. Elsie had been quiet about his ambitions for years, content, or so it seemed, to stand a step behind Doyle, always the friend who listened more than he spoke. What none of us understood was that Elsie had been watching Smith Freight's operations for a long while, learning its client list, its routes, its rhythms. The same way you learn a house you're planning to eventually walk out of with something valuable in your pockets. He hadn't set out that night to use Doyle. He just knew an opening when one dropped into his lap. That evening, after Verlene's loading dock conversation, Doyle showed up at Elsie's place the way he always did when something was sitting wrong in him. I imagine him pacing that kitchen, still turning over Verlene's words, still trying to decide if he was imagining things or seeing clearly for the first time. She's doing something, Doyle told him. The review, cutting my signing authority right after Mama's visit. That's not routine, Elsie. That's her. Elsie mostly just listened at first, nodding along, not saying much of anything. He told me later he wasn't even sure yet what he thought, only that Doyle needed someone to agree with him more than he needed advice. "You worked 15 years for that company," Elsie said, when Doyle finally paused for breath. "You own 10% of it outright, and they're treating you like some new hire who needs supervising. That don't sit right with me either, man. What am I supposed to do? Shares don't mean nothing if I can't move on them." Elsie shrugged at that, turning it over like he was just thinking out loud. "Then don't fight with the shares. Fight with what you actually have. 15 years of relationships. Clients who know you better than they know your mother. People on that board who respect you, whether they say it in meetings or not." He told me later he hadn't planned to say that. It just came out, the way a thought does when you're talking to a friend and not weighing every word. "Remind them," Elsie said, leaning back, "who's actually been running things day to day all these years. Not in some meeting where they can vote you down easy. Somewhere it actually costs something to ignore you." Doyle didn't answer right away. Elsie said he didn't think much of it in the moment either. Just two men in a kitchen, one of them venting, the other agreeing a little too easily. "All right," Doyle finally said. "I hear you." It was only weeks later, once everything had already come apart, that Elsie would admit to himself how conveniently that conversation had lined up with a filing cabinet over a month old that Doyle didn't yet know existed. Verlene came to see me herself, 2 days after it happened, sitting across from me in my kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she never drank a sip of. "I think you need to hear this from me before it comes to you some other way," she said. Doyle had asked to meet with her privately, away from the office, someplace that wouldn't feel like company business. He picked a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where nobody from Smith Freight would think to look for either of them. Verlene said he seemed calm when she first sat down. Rehearsed, almost, like a man who'd practiced what he wanted to say in a mirror more than once. "I respect you," Doyle told her. "I always have. That's why I wanted to talk to you directly instead of letting this play out in some meeting." "Talk to me about what, Doyle?" "This review, the signing authority, all of it." He leaned forward, she said, voice low, careful. "I think my mother's still grieving my father, in her own way, even 8 years later. And I think grief can make a person hold on tighter to things than they need to. I think some people on that board go along with her because it's easier than questioning her, not because they actually believe I've done something wrong." Verlene said she let him finish before she answered, because she wanted to be fair to him, whatever else was true. "Doyle," she said, "I've sat on that board for 11 years. I watched your father build this company from nothing, and I've watched your mother run it since without a single decision that wasn't sound. Nobody follows Nadine out of pity. We follow her because she's right more often than she's wrong." "So you think I'm wrong?" "I think," Verlene said, "that a review of signing authority across every department isn't a personal attack on you. It's just business catching up to itself. If you've got nothing to hide in your numbers, this costs you nothing but a little pride." Doyle sat back, she said, jaw tight, and for a moment she thought that might be the end of it, that he'd let it go the way a reasonable man lets go of a losing argument. "I worked 15 years for that company," he said instead. "I own part of it, and I'm being treated like a suspect in my own family's business." "You're being treated," Verlene told him gently, "like every other department head, Doyle. That's not persecution. That's fairness. Maybe it just feels different because it's the first time it's ever applied to you." He didn't respond to that. He thanked her for her time, paid for both their coffees even though she offered, and left first. Verlene told me she watched him walk to his car, and something about the way he sat behind the wheel a long moment before starting the engine told her the conversation wasn't over, just relocated. She was right. Doyle drove straight to Elsie's that same night. Later, he'd admit to me, still simmering from being told no by someone he respected too much to argue with directly. She wouldn't budge, Doyle told him, dropping into a kitchen chair like the weight of the day had finally caught up to his legs. Bored thinks it's routine, thinks I've got nothing to worry about. Elsie studied him a moment, unhurried, the way a man studies something he's already decided how to use. All right, Elsie said finally. If talking to them nice isn't gonna work, what else you willing to do? Junella told me this part herself, months later, when she finally felt safe enough to talk about those weeks without her voice catching halfway through. By then, she was days from her due date, moving through the house slower than she used to, one hand always finding the small of her back without her seeming to notice she was doing it. She said that final stretch of pregnancy already asks enough of a woman's body without her having to also manage a husband unraveling in slow motion beside her. Doyle had stopped being the man who came home tired and became the man who came home tight. She said she could feel it in the doorway before he even said a word. The particular quiet of him hanging his keys up too carefully, like a man trying not to let his hands shake. How was the day? She'd ask. Same as always. Fine, he'd say. Just that. Nothing behind it. She stopped pushing on the specifics after a while. She told me she'd learned those weeks to read her husband the way you learn to read weather, not from what he said, but from the pressure in a room before he said anything at all. What she couldn't stop noticing, she said, was how often his phone buzzed after dinner now. How he'd take those calls in the garage, door shut, voice low enough that she couldn't make out words, only tone. And his tone, lately, wasn't tired. It was urgent. Focused in a way office politics alone doesn't usually make a man sound. She asked him once, gently, if everything at work was all right. It's handled, he told her, already halfway to the garage door with his phone lighting up in his hand. Handled how? Junella. Just her name. Flat. A period at the end of a sentence he didn't want to keep having. She let it go. She always let it go those days, she told me. Partly from exhaustion, partly because some instinct in her kept insisting it wasn't yet her business to force open, and partly, if she was honest, because some part of her was afraid of what she might hear if she pushed too hard. One night, close to 11, unable to sleep with the particular restlessness that comes in those final days before a baby arrives, she got up for water and heard Doyle's voice coming low from the garage, door not quite pulled shut all the way. She said she almost turned back. She told me later she wishes some nights she had. Instead, she stood there in the hallway, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, and listened. I'm telling you, they've done business with us for 6 years, Doyle was saying, voice tight, controlled in a way that unsettled her more than shouting would have. If Bellhaven Shipping hears there's instability at the top, they're not going to wait around to find out how it shakes out. Junella said she stood frozen in that hallway, turning the name over in her mind. Bellhaven Shipping. Not a name Doyle had ever mentioned at their dinner table, not a client she'd ever heard attached to anything routine. Something in the way he said it, careful, deliberate, like a man handling something he knew could burn him, told her this wasn't ordinary office talk anymore. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. She just lay there beside the empty space where Doyle would eventually return to bed, hours later, smelling faintly of the garage, saying nothing at all about who he'd been talking to, or why. Roscoe called me himself this time, instead of waiting for me to call him, and that alone told me something serious had landed on his desk. I need you sitting down for this, he said. Bellhaven Shipping had been with us 6 years, one of the steadier accounts on our books, the kind of client that doesn't ask for much beyond reliability. Their operations manager had called Roscoe directly, uneasy, wanting to know off the record whether there was any truth to what he'd been told. Doyle had reached out to him personally, not through the company line, not through any official channel. A private call, careful in its wording, but clear enough in its meaning. I'd learn later, from Doyle himself, that the call hadn't come easy to him. He told me he'd sat in his own car outside Bellhaven's offices for nearly 20 minutes beforehand, phone in his lap, telling himself this wasn't betrayal, just protecting his own future in case the board turned on him completely. He said he'd almost driven off twice. He said some part of him kept hearing Junella's voice asking him to just be reasonable, to go to his mother instead of around her. He told himself he'd stop short, just plant a seed. Nothing more. Nothing. He couldn't walk back if it went nowhere. It didn't stay small. Once he was on the phone, he said the words came easier than he expected them to, each one justifying the next. He'd suggested there was instability at the top of Smith Freight. He'd mentioned gently that he might be starting something of his own soon, something Bellhaven might want to consider before committing to another year with us. I sat with that a long moment before I could even find words for it. He didn't say that outright, Roscoe told me, careful, like he wanted to be fair even now. But he said enough that Bellhaven's manager read between the lines clearly. He's worried enough to be asking me directly instead of just quietly not renewing. Is this, I asked slowly, something the board could remove him for? Roscoe didn't hesitate. Nadine, this isn't a gray area. Contacting a client to suggest instability while hinting at a competing venture while he's still drawing a salary and holds a board seat here. That's a breach of duty of loyalty. Any court would see it that way. You'd have grounds for immediate termination, and depending on how far this goes, grounds for legal action against him directly. I sat in Herschel's office, that same drawer still open, and I thought about what it would mean to do exactly what Roscoe was telling me I had every right to do. I want it documented, I told Roscoe. Everything. The call, Bellhaven's account of it, all of it, time-stamped and filed properly. And then nothing. For now. I'm not taking this public, Roscoe. Not yet. Maybe not at all if I can help it. He was quiet a moment. Can I ask why? Because the moment this becomes a lawsuit, I said, it stops being a mistake my son made and starts being a story. His father's name in the paper, tied to his son's disgrace. I won't do that to Herschel's memory. And I won't do it to my grandchild, coming into this world in a matter of days, inheriting a name already dragged through something ugly before he's even drawn breath. Roscoe didn't argue. He simply said he understood and that he'd keep everything documented, quietly, in case restraint ever stopped being the right choice. I thought that was the end of it, for the moment. I was wrong. 2 days later, Verlene called me, her voice carrying a weight I didn't like the shape of. Nadine, she said, one of the newer board members, Thaddeus, has been asking questions. Somebody mentioned to him, in passing, that there's tension around Doyle's authority, that maybe the review was more personal than procedural. He wants a full account at the next meeting. I asked her how Doyle seemed, hearing any of this secondhand. Steadier, Verlene admitted, like a man who thinks the wind just changed direction in his favor. The board meeting Thaddeus called for landed on a Thursday, and I walked into that room already knowing it would be harder than the last one. Thaddeus was younger than most of us at that table, sharp in the way new money often is, still learning that sharp and wise aren't always the same thing. He opened by saying he wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He simply felt, given some things he'd heard, that the board owed itself a full and transparent review of the recent restructuring decisions, who initiated them, why now, and whether personal matters had shaped what was framed as routine governance. I watched Doyle while Thaddeus spoke. My son sat straighter than he had in weeks, hands folded calm on the table, the particular stillness of a man who believes, for the first time in a long while, that the room might actually be turning his way. "I think that's a fair request," Doyle said when Thaddeus finished. "I've said all along this review felt more personal than procedural. I'm glad somebody else is finally willing to say it out loud." A few board members exchanged glances. Not agreement exactly, but not disagreement either. Just the uncomfortable quiet of people who don't want to be the one to speak first. I kept my voice level. "I have no objection to a full and transparent review," I said. "I'd welcome it. I'd only ask that it include everything relevant, including how certain client relationships have been handled recently." Thaddeus tilted his head at that. "What client relationships are we talking about, specifically?" "That's exactly what a full review would tell us," I said. "I'd rather not shape the answer before we've looked." He studied me a moment, clearly turning that over. "That sounds like you already know something the rest of us don't." "It sounds," I said, "like a woman asking for the same transparency you're asking for. Nothing more." Doyle's eyes flicked to mine for the briefest second. I didn't blink. Thaddeus didn't press further, though I noticed he wrote something down before moving on, unwilling yet to let the exchange go entirely unremarked. The meeting ended without resolution, which Thaddeus framed as progress, a first step toward accountability. I watched Doyle shake his hand on the way out, saw the small, satisfied set of my son's shoulders, a man already tasting something he hadn't touched in weeks. I heard, secondhand again, that he called Elsie that same night, voice lighter than it had been in a month. "Told you," Doyle said. Winds shifting. Thaddeus is asking real questions now. A few more people start doubting her, and this whole review falls apart on its own. Elsie, I'm told, simply agreed with him, warm and encouraging, already counting a different kind of victory than the one Doyle believed they were sharing. At home, Junella was in no state to celebrate anything. She was 2 days past her due date now, restless, uncomfortable, her body telling her plainly that time was almost gone. She told me later she'd already quietly packed a bag for her parents' house, not out of anger yet, just practicality. She wanted to be near her mother when her time came, wherever this fight between Doyle and his own family landed by then. She didn't tell Doyle she'd made the decision. She said some part of her already sensed that whatever was happening at that company, it was pulling him further away from her by the day, and she needed to protect herself and the baby from wherever that pulling might eventually lead. 2 days after that meeting, Roscoe called me again, his voice careful in a way I'd come to recognize as him circling something he wasn't ready to say outright yet. "I need something pulled for me," he said. "The original contact log from Bellhaven, not the summary I gave you before. The actual timestamps, the account activity around it." "Why now?" "Because something about the sequence doesn't sit right with me," Roscoe said slowly. "A filing crossed my desk this week, completely unrelated business, and a name in it caught my attention. I want to be wrong about what I'm thinking, Nadine, but I'd rather chase it down quietly than let it surprise either of us later." Roscoe came to my office 3 days later with a folder he set down on my desk, like it was heavier than paper had any right to be. "I want to walk you through how I got here," he said, "so you understand this wasn't a guess." He explained it slowly. The Bellhaven contact had bothered him from the start, not just what was said, but how well-informed it sounded. Details about our contract renewal cycle that Doyle wouldn't have had reason to know unless someone had pulled the account history recently. Roscoe had requested our own internal access logs first, quietly, to see who'd touched that file in the weeks before the call. One name outside the finance department had accessed it twice. Elsie Prather's login, through a vendor portal Doyle had given him access to years ago, and no one had ever revoked. That thread led him to a public filings database, checking whether Elsie had registered anything recently under his own name. He had. A logistics company, registered over a month earlier. Before Doyle ever called Bellhaven, before Verlene's loading dock conversation, before the diner, before any of it. Roscoe cross-referenced the filing address, the registered agent, even a shared vendor account Elsie hadn't bothered hiding carefully enough. "He's been building this the whole time," Roscoe said. "Doyle isn't fighting for control of Smith Freight, Nadine. He's being used to help someone else start a new one." I sat with that a long moment, feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. Not for myself, for my son, who still didn't know the ground he was standing on had never been solid at all. We brought it to the board that Thursday. Roscoe laid it out plainly: the access logs, the filing dates, the timeline, the client contact traced directly back to conversations Elsie had coached. Thaddeus, to his credit, asked hard questions, wanting to be certain before he moved. By the end, he didn't just withdraw his earlier concerns. He apologized to me directly, in front of everyone, for ever doubting the review had been anything but necessary. Doyle sat through all of it in silence. I watched something in my son collapse quietly at that table, piece by piece, as 15 years of certainty rearranged itself into something much smaller and much sadder. I didn't know it yet, but at that very hour, something else was collapsing at home. Junella told me, much later, that she'd woken that morning with a tightness low in her back she didn't yet recognize for what it was. She said she'd been moving slow through the kitchen, timing something she couldn't quite name, when Doyle's phone rang loud on the counter, and he stepped into the garage to take it. Door not shut all the way. She heard Elsie's voice first, tinny through the speaker, urgent in a way that didn't sound like comfort. "They're asking questions, Doyle. If Roscoe's pulling records, we need our story straight before the board digs deeper into how this all lines up." "Our story," Doyle repeated. And Junella said his voice had a strange flatness to it, like a man hearing something for the first time despite having lived inside it for weeks. "You know how this looks if they find the filing," Elsie said. "We need to be saying the same thing." Junella told me she stood frozen in that kitchen, hand pressed to the counter, understanding all at once that whatever her husband had been fighting for these past weeks was never peace, was never fairness. It was something built alongside a man who'd been planning his own exit long before Doyle ever agreed to help him dig it. The tightness in her back came again, sharper this time, unmistakable now for what it was. She didn't call out to Doyle. She didn't confront him in that garage doorway the way some other woman might have. She went upstairs, quiet and steady, and finished packing the bag she'd started days before. She called her mother, told her it was time, told her she was coming, alone, and asked her to please have everything ready. By the time Doyle walked back into that empty house, still shaken from whatever had unraveled at the board meeting that afternoon, the only thing waiting for him was a folded note on the kitchen counter and a house gone completely, terribly still. Doyle told me all of this himself, weeks later, when he was finally ready to say it out loud without his voice breaking halfway through. He said he knew something was wrong the moment he turned onto his own street. Every light in the house was off. Junella's car was gone from the driveway, and the quiet sitting over that house wasn't the ordinary quiet of an empty room. It was the specific, deliberate quiet of a place someone had left on purpose. He found the note on the kitchen counter, folded once, her handwriting steady in a way that told him she hadn't written it in anger. "I'm going to my mother's. It's time, and I don't want to bring our baby into whatever this has become. Call me when you're ready to tell me the truth. All of it." He said he read it 4 times before the words actually landed. Then he went looking for anything that might tell him more. and found, tucked in the drawer where she kept her prenatal folder, a small stack of hospital paperwork she'd already had prepared for weeks. Not a decision made in the heat of that afternoon. A plan she'd been quietly carrying, ready, for longer than he wanted to admit. He called her parents' house twice that evening. Grady answered the second time, kind but firm, telling him Junella was resting, that things were progressing, that he'd call when there was real news to share and not a moment before. The real news came near midnight. A son. Healthy. Junella exhausted, but fine. Grady's voice on the phone was gentle even then, but Doyle told me he could hear, underneath the kindness, a father choosing his words carefully around a man he wasn't yet ready to fully trust. Doyle sat alone in that house afterward, a father now, with no one there to hand him his own child. I didn't know any of that yet, sitting with Verlene in my own kitchen that same night, still turning over everything Roscoe had laid out at the board meeting. Verlene had stayed later than usual, sensing, I think, that I needed the company more than I was willing to say. "You did the right thing," she told me. "All of it. The review, the restraint with Bellhaven, all of it." "I know," I said. And I did know it in the part of my mind that deals in facts. But there's a part of a mother that doesn't answer to facts. "I keep thinking about the day I gave him those shares," I told her. "I was so proud of him. And some nights, since all this, I wonder if I failed him somewhere long before any of this happened. If I should have pulled him in closer instead of keeping the wheel from him so long." Verlene reached over and put her hand over mine, something she'd never done in 11 years of sitting across boardroom tables from me. "Herschel didn't leave that company to you because he doubted Doyle's heart," she said. "He left it to you because he trusted yours. There's a difference, Nadine. Don't let one bad season make you forget it." I thought of Herschel's voice again that night, the same words I'd carried since that first evening in his office. Don't rescue him from a lesson he needs. I hadn't. And it had cost more than I'd expected it to. Doyle told me that same night, alone in that quiet house with a new son somewhere he couldn't yet hold. He sat staring at his phone for a long while. Then, for the first time since a birthday visit that had started all of this, he scrolled to my name and pressed call. He called first. Then he asked if he could come by, not to talk about the company, not about shares or boards or anything sitting between us these past weeks. Just to see me. I told him yes before he even finished asking. He showed up 2 days later, and he wasn't alone. Junella stood beside him, thinner in the face than I remembered, but steady. A small bundle held close against her chest. Behind them, Grady and Corliss Kittrell, dressed like they'd come for something they considered important, because I understood, watching them step through my door, that they had. Doyle didn't wait for me to speak first. He stood in my living room. My son, 30 years old and looking younger than I'd seen him in a long while, and he said the words plainly without dressing them up in excuses. "I was wrong," he said. "Not just about the wedding, Ma, about all of it. I spent so long trying to prove I didn't need you that I almost lost everything that actually mattered." "Doyle, let me finish," he said, gentle but firm. And I did. I let a man who never cared about me talk me into believing my own mother was the enemy. I lied to my wife's family about something that should have been a celebration. I said something to you in that hallway I will regret until I die. You didn't deserve any of that. Not one bit of it. Junella stepped forward then, shifting the baby carefully in her arms. "This is Herschel," she said quietly. "We named him after your husband. Doyle wanted his son carrying that name forward, the right way, this time." I felt something in my chest give way, soft and sudden, hearing that. Corliss spoke next. warm, a little emotional herself. "Mrs. Smith, we owe you an apology too, even though we didn't know it at the time. We should have asked more questions that day. We're sorry it took this long to sit in a room with you properly." "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her. "You believed my son because decent people believe each other until they're given a reason not to. That's not a fault in you." Grady stepped in then, extending his hand, and I took it. "We'd like to do this right," he said. "A proper gathering. Family, on both sides. The kind of celebration a marriage like theirs should have had from the start. We'd be honored if you'd help us plan it." I looked at my son standing in my living room, humbled in a way pride had never once allowed him to be, holding his wife's hand while his father's name rested in his newborn son's. And I understood that whatever this fight had cost all of us, it had also handed us something we might never have arrived at any easier way. "I'd like that very much," I said. We sat together a long while after that, longer than any conversation Doyle and I had shared in years, easy in a way I hadn't expected so soon. Little Herschel slept through most of it, undisturbed by the weight resting quietly over the room. Before they left that evening, Doyle hugged me the way he used to as a boy. No embarrassment in it this time, no rush to pull away. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he whispered, "even when I gave you every reason to." I watched them all gather their things. This small, crowded room full of people who had traveled through hurt, pride, and quiet consequence to arrive back at something worth calling family. And standing there, surrounded by every person who mattered, I realized I had never once needed the world to call me important. I only ever needed my son to.